All right, great. Hit the 100 mark. Let's kick it off. Happy Saturday, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. Really looking forward to this one with Jack Butcher. He's been very generous to come on and just talk creative process with us. We're going to dive into a couple principles. We're going to dig through some archives. It's going to be, I'm going to stop sharing my screen as I talk to start. But other than that, a few announcements. I think first and foremost, give yourselves a pat on the back for being on day 14 or day 13. Day 13. Nothing to take lightly. 13 days of writing and publishing. It's incredible. We've got some that are just absolutely crushing it. So like we do it every Saturday, give yourself that big pat on the back because it's not to be taken lightly that we're here. Other than that, kind of same cadence, good work. Everyone on the feedback session yesterday, dropping essays under Cole's thread. That was cool to read through. We did a little bit of both feedback and idea generation. So hopefully a lot of you kind of walked away with something more to write about. And then just the normal stuff, continue to ship. That's really what it is. The 30 days of shipping sequence is about to kind of pivot a little bit from idea generation to more how you can start to repurpose and work with your content in different ways. So that's going to change up a little bit over the next few days. So be on the lookout for that. But, other than that, I want to make sure we get as much time here. So Jack, thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks for having me, mate. I appreciate it.
All right.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah. So for anyone who doesn't know, Jack, you don't spend enough time on Twitter, or you just spend less time on Twitter than I do, which is probably a good thing. But Jack you want to give just a 1-minute background for anyone who might not, know you, Jack?
Sure. So designer by trade and spent 10 years in marketing and advertising in New York. And the last 2 years or so, I've been working for myself. Well, the last 3 or 4 years I've been working for myself, but the last 2 years specifically, been building a brand called Visualize Value, which takes a lot of different shapes and forms. We have a lot of front-end content, which is essentially designed to distill, simplify concepts that I've found useful in the last few years in building a business, and build some education products, and we do dabble in a little bit of art as well. So that's what we're up to.
Awesome. So, and as we go through this today, anyone who has questions, we're going to save some time for just written in questions. You can drop them in the chat, and we'll save some time. Daniel's going to curate them. So I'm going to share my screen to start and talk about a couple. So I shot Jack 6 kind of creative principles that I'm interested in hearing his thoughts on. A lot of them I've learned from him. They are really some of the core ones that we talk about all the time. It's really I see these 6 as really the foundational principles of Ship 30. So I'm looking forward to take this in a bunch of different directions, but let's start with number 1, which we say from day one, making noise and listen for signal. Jack, when you see that, what does that mean to you? How do you think about it with creating content, with sharing ideas, anything you have to kind of say there?
Yeah, sure. I think this is like a really foundational idea in my approach, and has been for the last couple of years. But I think foundationally, it comes down to asymmetry, right? Like the asymmetric opportunity that exists in experimenting a lot of times. So there's like 2 feedback loops that happen if you're working on a consistent basis. Obviously you're like internally getting better and you're like honing the creative muscles of just showing up every day, but then the act of putting it out into the market is getting you feedback that is helping you improve. So if you pair those 2 ideas with the cost of inaction, or how, like, I was thinking about this a little differently yesterday, like the idea of talk being quite literally cheap. So you can go out and broadcast a message to tens, hundreds of thousands of people, get some validation, and then that, that validation can turn into all sorts of things depending on your skill set, your interests, your curiosity, whatever that might be. So I think we have a unique opportunity at this point in time to participate in networks like Twitter, share our ideas, and it's a very, very low cost way to validate things. So, before networks like this existed, you would sit and maybe you'd write a manuscript for a book and then take it to a publisher, and they'd be like, I'm not interested in this. Like, there's no market demand for this idea, versus flipping that on its head and taking all these low cost actions on a consistent basis, and not saying one thing is going to give you the idea, but every single thing you put out gives you like a little bit more fidelity, or it helps you sort of coalesce towards a point, which, maybe becomes a business you start, a book you write, a product you launch. So I think it comes down to that principle of very cheap feedback and participating in an environment where there is so much noise. The cost of producing something that doesn't resonate is zero, unless we're talking about like doing something incredibly offensive, which, chances of you doing that are low if your intentions are good. So I think coming to terms with that is really, that's like a chasm you cross from at least the environments I used to work in, where it's very uncomfortable to put out not necessarily unfinished thoughts, but put out unvalidated thoughts without, putting it through a committee and talking to 20 people before you feel confident enough to put it out. So it is like a behavioral change, or a different lens with which you view the world and how you think, where everything you put out is a mechanism for you to get better and get free feedback from the market.
Especially, so many things there I want to double click on, but like, especially on Twitter, where it's almost free upside with everything because of the way the algorithm works. If you put something out that doesn't resonate, it just floats through the river of noise. But if it is good, it gets engagement, and that engagement begets more engagement, right? So that, as I scroll through, so using a little advanced search, I dug through the archives. And so these are tweets from you from 2019, July through October. So for anyone who's familiar with Jack, these are still things you're talking about today, obviously, right?
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about your approach to kind of noise making, and then the way you listen for signal and kind of what you've been building?
So I think the other part of this is kind of occupying two spaces. You have this internal monologue where you're trying to refine your ideas, and then publishing those ideas, regardless of whether or not you have, 10,000 people looking at them. Like the process of publishing and the process of just like, it's like the finality of the creative process allows you to like refine the idea mechanism, if that makes sense. So like, if you just sit on something and kind of try and refine the idea over and over and over again and never put it out, for me, at least the way I think and the way I work, that creates like a block in my mind. So I'll have a thought, I'll spend 15 minutes kind of thinking about how to articulate it in a decent way, put it out, and then even the feedback to that thought will trigger some new ideas, or will further refine the idea that I'm trying to get across. So in my mind, they're kind of inseparable, right? The improvement and the process of publishing is such a great way to like almost defrag or clear the backlog in your mind. And it's I think you guys have built a great product here for that reason, right? It's a muscle that you show up every day, and your form improves as a function of repetition, and even the space between ideas, you're thinking about it more critically because you have more information to go off of. You're gathering data even at a subconscious level just by publishing stuff, and you're honing your gut in a way, right? I think we talk about analytics and we talk about data in a way that I think is valid, but so much of it is about just you develop better creative instinct as a function of creating more stuff.
It's like, especially if you build it up in your head that you have to refine it in certain ways, if the market doesn't even want that idea, you're wasting time,
right?
In double time, right? So the second you have this thing in putting it out there, that immediate feedback, you save yourself weeks or months of kind of, building up this friction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have some too, Jack. I'm curious to get your take on this because, I see a lot of questions in the chat about how do you, especially in the beginning, you're publishing into the void and you're not getting the feedback you want, right? And so it's always this question of, well, how do you choose to keep going and whatever. And Dickie, when you were just sharing your screen, like those were pretty old tweets. Like those were 2019, Jack, and I can see how even your voice back then has changed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you write differently, and back then you were using almost this more like opposites mechanism. You would pick words that were opposite of each other, and that's what made the tweet work. And
yeah.
So I'm curious, like your perspective on when you were first starting, you were doing the agency life, and then I'm going to start publishing content, and your perspective of, I'm putting stuff out, none of it's really going viral, but I want to keep exploring, and I'm not that attached to the external aspect of it.
Yeah. So 2019, I'm trying to think back to what the end goal was there, or the outcome I was trying to drive at. I think just like the desire to become a more concise writer was so much a part of the motivation back then. And I think the externalities did play a part in it. Like you want it to resonate with people, and you want some validation from what you're doing, but it almost was a single player game, where I was like, I'd either like read a page of a book or a chapter of a book, or reflect on a bunch of experiences that I'd have, and try and like pass an idea through the filter of all of my experience, if that makes sense. So if you have a sentence that you've written, then you're like, is that true? The situation I'm in now, if I read that 5 years ago when I was working in that agency job, would that statement still be true? And then 5 years before that, would that be true? So I think the evolution, like it was very mechanical to begin with, intentionally, right? I think like that, it's almost just, I think the way you build any company to scale is you just stay super focused on meeting sort of the expectation or building trust with the audience, because they know what to expect from you consistently. And then over time, I think these aren't really conscious milestones, but you feel more creative freedom as a result of having almost like completed that chapter. So it's like I've externalized all of my experience up to a point, and then you get to this stage where you're just like, I feel like I've said that at this point, so now I need to go and find I need to basically top up on fresh experiences so I can distill those into something worth sharing. So I think it's almost like this reservoir of experiences. It's like, how could I take all of this stuff that I've experienced and concisely convey it? It was also like, they're also jumping off points for products. And I was running the agency in 2019. So perhaps that a lot of that stuff was inspired by maybe client relationships or projects that I was working on, experiences that I was having on a daily basis. How can I take that 8 hours of agony or whatever it was that I experienced that day and turn it into 2 lines? And I think that's just been the case consistently, but the underlying set of experiences has changed. So the style of the writing, and I think the type of insight and the output changes. They're almost like kind of staggered, right? You have one lagging the other. And then the more resonance you find, the more, if you go down the product route, for example, you get more time to think, you try more things, and then fresh ideas come as a result of the time you've created by being consistent. It's a bit of a rambling answer, but did it make sense?
Yeah. I mean, if the creative process was easy to distill down into one sentence, we'd all have it figured out, right?
Yeah. There would be no. Go on.
Or go. Well, I was going to say we kind of touched on number 2, which was consistency creates competence, and I love that one because something I like to say is no one has 50 shitty versions of anything. They either have 10 shitty versions and quit, or they keep up with it long enough to get it figured out. What does that mean to you, both on, building a design, being able to design well, being able to write well, things like that?
So yeah, one, I think just the pure repetition and muscle memory of consistency, and the other thing is like the commitment you're making to the people reading or viewing your work as well. So you have like these two forces at play. Like, what am I trying to say here? You feel responsible to evolve as a result of like setting that expectation. So it could get unhealthy if you do it the wrong way, but I think like some level of public accountability and like Ship 30 for 30 is an example of this, right? The essay you write on day one, if you think about that through the lens of one reader, they read it and they're like, oh, that's good. But when they read the 30th one, you want them to think it's outstanding, right? Or you want them to recognize the evolution of the work. So I think for me, at least, it's a combination of challenging myself and thinking about what am I delivering to somebody that's reading my work. And on a daily basis, is my communication basically helping them increase the fidelity of their understanding of this subject, right? So I'll use a contextual example of Build Once, Sell Twice, which is the title of one of the products we built for Visualize Value. There's like maybe 100 different ways to like close the gap between someone that doesn't understand that concept or has never been introduced to it and just totally gets it. So every day you're just like filling in the gaps of understanding there. I was talking to Celia yesterday about one of the most powerful devices I think we have as creatives or writers or designers is basically the ability to empathize with where you were 5 years ago, 4 years, 1 year ago, right? And like some of the stuff that you start to think is incredibly obvious or like cliche because it's just spiraling around your head all day long. I think you have to recognize that, especially if you're on this like self-elected journey of publishing, you are in an incredible minority, like that you've self-selected into sharing your ideas on the internet, even though it doesn't feel like that because you've opted into basically an echo chamber of people who are doing the same thing. But there is, hundreds of millions, billions of people that haven't been exposed to those ideas, that aren't going to learn or aren't going to have the epiphany you've had by reading one tweet. You're essentially, I think it's a Zig Ziglar quote. It's like, motivation is like hygiene. We recommend it daily. Like it wears off, right? So if you're idea or this like set of ideas that you're trying to promote is important to you, then it's kind of you have a duty to continue to elaborate on them and look at different ways to explain them to people. And I think the thing that we lose sight of really, really easily is just how much we're in our own heads and how much we fail to empathize with where we were before we understood this thing. And just because you've sent out 2 tweets about this subject does not mean that you have educated your audience from 0 to wherever you are.
Two quick things, Dickie, if you don't mind me jumping real quick. Yeah, one, I mean, just for context, I love this idea of you're self-selecting. I mean, so the framework that essentially every social network operates on is what's called like the 1-9-90 rule, which is on Twitter, there's 600 million people, right? 1% of those are creators, and 9% of those are curators, and 90% of those are the readers and the consumers and just I just scroll around. And so this idea where you say, I'm going to start writing, I'm going to start creating, I'm going to start designing, you are automatically putting yourself either in the 9 or the 1%, which is incredible, right?
Right.
But taking that a little further, it's like, I remember, I'm sure you've done this a zillion times, but I saw this pop up in my feed where you had written something once and then like 3 hours later you said the same exact thing but like removed 2 words and you like refined it and you like did it again, you know? And I think there's so much of this feeling of I already said it so I shouldn't say it again, or my audience has already heard this from me, I shouldn't say it again. And I feel like you're a great example. There's tons of people on Twitter that are like this where you've had incredible reach and yet you're still probably only tapping into 1-2% of all of Twitter, right?
Yeah, it's a bizarre, like I don't know who said it, but it's like the greatest shortcoming of human beings is the inability to understand the exponential function. And Twitter is just like I mean, it's a bizarre thing to think like anybody on this Zoom, I'm sure, has more people reading their tweets than could fit in the room they're sitting in right now, right? And we think of that as like normal at this point, but like if you looked at the raw data, like you are in a very, very small subset of people that are consistently producing and trying to communicate an idea intentionally. So yeah, just reminding yourself of that, I find, can help with the consistency piece. Like consistency is, I used the word duty before, but it's like service, right? It's like if you go to a restaurant, you go back to a restaurant because the food you had last time was excellent. And in the world of content, same rules apply, right? It's like I'm going to keep following Dickie because I love like his insight about writing. And I think maybe there's like an argument that that's like a really mechanical way to think about it, but in service of creating a deep connection around a very specific topic, I think it's a powerful strategy. And then the optionality does increase as you start to find that resonance, right? I think if you think about like how a politician campaigns, it's like, this is a platform. These are the like 4 slogans, let's say, that like completely encapsulate what we're about.
Over and over and over again.
Hit them with those ideas. And then, yeah, you could get into the nuance in different areas and with different, like have different conversations. And I think a lot of people get put off that journey because it's like, man, I don't really want to repeat myself. It's like, well, that's fine, but you can't expect like people who are consuming 15,000 pieces of information a day, let's say, to associate something with you. So I think when you start to feel this hitting, it's like when people are tagging you in places where you weren't before, right? If somebody has an idea or articulates an idea that's parallel to something you've been talking about, and then you see someone go, oh, you should check out this person's ideas on this, that's when you start to get some feedback that your ideas have kind of taken on a life of their own, or they occupy a place in people's minds that you couldn't have even foreseen when you started talking about them. You've just like the repetition has really just really taken hold.
Yeah, I just remember you saying this tweet of everyone wants to find their niche, but barely anyone wants to repeat themselves every day, which is the struggle of it, right? It's like, oh, I want to find my niche, but that really means you're going to have 3 ideas, and how you're going to figure out how to say those in 1,000 different ways becomes the whole ball game.
Yeah, and I think another false limitation we place on ourselves is that we're arrogant enough to think that the like one articulation of this thing has completely summarized it. It's like you could spend 3 lifetimes explaining one idea, right? I think there are obviously examples of people who've written. Nassim Taleb is a great example of this, right? You could take one of his books and spend 3 years like exploring that single concept or idea in thousands, hundreds of thousands of different ways. I think I don't want to repeat myself is more of a symptom of you haven't found something you're interested enough in to keep exploring, to keep digging into, to look at like different ways to bring it to other people. It's like, if you really value something, I think you're just motivated to share it. And that journey of like making noise and finding signal is the act of finding that thing that you're passionate about. And that may change. I'm not saying you find that and you do that forever, but it's a really great mechanism for like digging deep for a period of time and really articulating like, or building out the fidelity of the idea in public, right? Maybe you land on a tweet that summarizes that. Nobody wants to repeat themselves. And you could write a book about that idea, right? Around like the anthropological reasons why we don't want to like seem repetitive, or, the way the Twitter algorithm like tricks you into thinking that, I love what you said about the non-engagement. Your tweets that don't get engaged with just sort of slip into the ether. And one thing I learned from like messing about with a little meme account is you can basically look at the analytics in the first 90 seconds on a tweet and you know what's going to happen to it. And not only does it slip past, it just doesn't get served. Like it doesn't go into the timeline of like, if it doesn't hit that initial like ratio of engagement, whatever the algorithm deems that to be, it's not like people are scrolling past it. Like that real estate is worthless to Twitter, so they just annexed it. Like nobody's even going to see it. And I think like we have a very linear view of that, where it's like, oh my God, the 800 people that are looking at my tweets, every single one of them looked at this and thought it was shit. That's not the case, right? It was served to 3 of them, and then like it was like, oh, scroll past it. So nobody else was it wasn't even placed in another feed. So I think getting familiar or trying to at least understand the mechanics of that is really going to help with the consistency piece and the publish piece. And I think we also underestimate the silent readers too, right? Nick was saying this about like there's 90% of people that are just scrolling through your stuff. They're not even going to interact with it because whatever signal it sends, maybe they work somewhere and they don't want people to know that they're looking at some entrepreneurial perspective on something. I had this realization on LinkedIn where a bunch of my content when I first started my agency just nobody would interact with it on LinkedIn. And one of the really interesting things about that, I think, is the social graph on LinkedIn is completely different. It's all your coworkers, your boss, like people that you're interviewing with. So the signal it sends when you interact with a certain piece of content, especially if it's contrarian in any way, is like disrupting your progress as a professional potentially. So yeah, we could probably summarize this conversation in like 3 sentences, but the downside is so low. And we really underestimate or overestimate the like negative consequences of producing something that doesn't resonate at scale. Because you could go back another year or two on those tweets, and there'd be just crickets. And before that, I was doing stuff on Facebook, and before that, I was doing stuff on LinkedIn, and it was just nothing. But it was making me think more deeply about why that wasn't working. And that's unfortunately the you don't walk into the gym on the first day and deadlift 600 pounds, right?
I did, but Dickie, I might be jumping ahead here, but this I think brings up a really interesting point, which is I think there's an underlying skill here that you're also talking about, which is you're creating, but you're not, or maybe you were in the beginning and you had to overcome this, but you're not overly married to the result. And I've noticed this, I see this with writers all the time, where there's this feeling of, I took the time to write it, and so I deserve for people to read it, right? And that you walk in with this like expectation and almost this entitlement. And it took me a really long time to realize that I was doing that, and to go, okay, I need to detach from the expectation, and I need to accept that if I get 11 views on my tweet, that means my tweet isn't really good. And that's not Twitter's fault. That's my own skill, and I need to refine that, right? So I'm curious, like, was that a conscious process for you? Is that something that you've noticed over time? And how do you compare how you create today, and you're not that married to it, maybe, compared to like 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah. I think the more you understand how the platforms work, the less the less harrowing it is to imagine that, like, actually, you know what, I think maybe this is a crude way to look at it, but it's just like the commercials of something, right? It's like product market fit. You could take that idea down to the most atomic, to use a concept that you guys like push all the time. It's like product market fit exists at the tweet level, right? It exists at the essay level, exists at the email level. Like, if you're making a cold intro email to someone and they don't respond, it's because your email was bad. And I think, like, we understand that in every other area of our life, but for some reason, like, because I think creativity is such a personal thing, perhaps, we take it really personally when a piece of work that we like labored over is not received well. Again, I think it's just a pure repetition thing to get past that, and maybe looking at like every creator you admire, or every person that's produced stuff that you admire, and there is not an example of somebody that hasn't put out stuff to crickets in the history of anything, right? It's just it's always a process of iteration. One of my favorite like examples from one of the most prolific creators on the internet now, Joe Rogan. If you guys haven't seen the first video of his podcast,
oh, it's ridiculous.
You can't even get the microphone to work. It's like, it's an absolute train wreck. And you just don't, like, I don't know. I think the exposure to people that have figured it out and that have been in the game so much longer, it's just so easy to, especially if you're, the people that you aspire to, not necessarily emulate, but the people who are in a position that you would like to be in a similar position of, have gone through these repetitions and failures, and still now probably put things out and like, man, that could have gone better. I have a recent example in the art world. So I've been experimenting with some NFT stuff, and this is like a really interesting trend that's, I think, changing everything, is like things on the blockchain. So you're publishing stuff with absolute permanence, and it is public, and failure is very, very like, if there's a market value placed on your work and it reaches X or Y, then that's like a massive signal that you can't reverse or change or anything else. And that like really got to me in the beginning. I put one piece up, I think because it was the first piece, it did well. And then you put more out, and it's like, why is the demand for this not like astronomical every time? It's like, one, because there's a supply and demand situation going on, and two, because that's just not how the world works, right? I think Picasso made like what 55,000 paintings in his life or something nuts. You can look that up, but it's in the tens of thousands. I think 50,000. And I don't know. I think we're just really bad at understanding that the people we admire aren't just like naturally gifted; they grafted for their ability to produce amazing things. So you never get over it, though. I wouldn't say like you reach a day where it's just like, oh, I don't, I have no attachment to what anybody thinks about this stuff. It's more of I am way more cognizant of reality at this point, and I'm gonna use that as a mechanism for evaluating where I am, what I'm producing, and then the final piece is just like, okay, how do I correct this? Just make better stuff. Like that's the only way out, right? It's just to keep making stuff, make it better. There is no other option. You either stop, do something else, and by the way, you're going to be back at the beginning of the curve of whatever that thing is you're choosing to do instead of this. So no free lunches in the universe, right? That I think is I'm slowly getting introduced through my like exposure to crypto to all of these like fundamental truths. So like the laws of thermodynamics, like there are, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, right? And everything in the universe is a wave essentially. So you're not going to put out 30 atomic essays that are going to like trend in the the sidebar every time you publish. And if somebody does that, congratulations, but I would bet a decent amount of money that that's not going to happen. And it's just this like cyclical process. So like attaching yourself to or finding the thing that you just love to do and like letting the result be the secondary thing is a very, very difficult process. But one other thing I would say is like chasing those signals can be selfish in a good way too, where the visualized value aesthetic, this like really constrained aesthetic, is making me a better designer, whether or not the market responds like exceptionally well to every single thing. So this like selfish motivation that I am improving my craft as a result of pushing myself to produce something every day. There's like this, that's like a different curve almost. So when I was doing this to get client work, even if 3 people on Twitter saw this thing or interacted with this thing, it was an exercise that made me a better service provider in the context of like a one-on-one client relationship. So zooming out of Twitter being the only place that your ideas are like valid or validated, or that the act of publishing is I think that like you can separate the act of publishing from the feedback that you get from publishing. There is upside to just hitting the publish button, even if you never find out what happens after the fact. So that I think separating those two things is key. And the longer you do it, the more you understand some stuff's just not going to resonate, and that's just the way. Those are just the laws of thermodynamics.
Yeah, you guys thought this was a writing program, but it's writing and physics.
Everyone pull out your Coinbase accounts. We're going to buy some Bitcoin live.
There you go. It's crypto too. But I think it's where you kind of get your dopamine from in the creative process. Is it you publish something and then you sit refreshing the notifications, or is hitting that publish button internally satisfying enough for you to, like, if you got to mute the notifications, would you still do it? And it's a good question to ask, because the only way to sustainably do it is to separate your input from the market reaction, because eventually those will align.
Yeah. And I think I got taught this a few years ago, just acknowledging the difference between lead indicators and lag indicators. And we've talked about this, Dickie. It's like equity versus dividends, right? Like the lead indicator is the thing that you control. The lag indicator is going to come up with that. That's just like, if you are sincerely pursuing a creative process and practicing, the lag indicator will catch up. But like, one of my favorite like examples to give this context is like, if you're a salesperson, you don't measure like how many deals you closed. You do, like, that is a part of it, but you measure how many phone calls you make, right? Like, if you measure the thing that you can control, it's like, I'm gonna call 100 people a day, you know, and then I'm gonna, over time, if that 100 number stays consistent and I sincerely review my performance in all of those 100 phone calls every day, that lagging indicator of deals closed is going to improve. But if you can commit to the leading indicator that you're going to commit to, like the 30 essays in 30 days, or like those lag indicators could be all manner of things, right? It could be client projects closed. It could be how many likes on your tweet. It could be like how many DMs you received to discuss the idea in more detail. And you can't really predict that stuff before you get started, but you can commit to the thing you control, and you can join a group like this for accountability to do something like that. And the results are just astounding, and you can't predict them. Like, the stuff that's happening now as a result of like publishing black and white images on Twitter from 2 years ago, I would never, ever be able to predict them. But the alignment between like me just being interested in it and producing it constantly has been the only consistent factor. And if that went away, none of the other stuff would have happened.
I wonder too if this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently, is not just the analytical side of feedback, like looking at the data, but at least I get this sense with my own work, is that I could sit there in my apartment, whatever, and I could look at my work for hours, days, months, years, and I could pick it apart and think, I've seen everything, I've refined this as best I can. And then the moment I hit publish, I'm like, how did I not see that I forgot a comma there, right? Yeah. So also too, like, do you notice with your own process that the publishing aspect actually changes the way that you perceive your own work too?
Yeah, I definitely have that. And you don't, like, the lesson doesn't lock in until you make the commitment to publish, right? It's like the consequences aren't real until it's out there and in front of other people. This happens to me all the time. It's like, oh, I should have, or I'll think something like, oh, I should change that. And it's like, nah, it doesn't really matter. And then I press publish, and then it's like, yeah, I should have changed that. And then I won't make that mistake again the next time. But it's the act of publishing that really like locks in do I really feel this, or am I inventing a excuse to not publish? And in my experience, this sort of like this mix of the two, where I think I could my bias for publishing is maybe too high, honestly. It's like, I will put stuff out and I could maybe sit on it for a couple of days, or I think that optionality increases with reach, where it's like, I could sit and make something that's it's maybe that more time goes into, or develop something more intensely. But I think the thing that motivates me, or like my creative momentum, is really fueled by the publishing piece. And that, I think, depends on the individual, what your disposition is for that. But it's like I said this earlier, but like, frees up the queue. It's like, if I have something that's 90% there, I can't do anything else until that is gone out into the world and like is gathering feedback from the market. I wish I had that tendency to be like, you know what, I'm gonna sleep on this, and I'm gonna for certain things, right? For things that are a bit more like higher fidelity or have like, you know, higher consequences. But for example, like the education products I built, one took a week, one took 2 weeks. And it's like you could spend a year making those things, but it was like, I think that's some internal signal as well. It's like, how excited am I to put this out? There's a real what is the word I'm looking for? Relationship between how excited you are to publish something and how it's received over, like, maybe not on the individual level, but over time, like the things that you really love to make, that energy is like transmitted somehow through this thing. I'm sure people have experienced this, where it's like you just have this idea that's like, I have to share that, and more often than not, that thing like gets a lot more momentum and traction than this thing that you labored over for a ton of time. So it's almost fighting instinct in some cases there, and this obviously depends on what you do and the consequences of it. If you're a heart surgeon or something, it makes less sense. But if you're a creative and you're, you know, posting content on the internet, then I think that maybe it's something to do with authenticity, right? It's something to do with how much of you is in this thing, because you haven't tried to moderate it or mask it or adjust it to fit to what you think somebody wants to hear as opposed to what you want to say. So that's, and I think you have time boxes on these essays for the most part, right? It's like, let's sprint them and produce them and publish them. And I think that is like, it stops you from overthinking. And I think you can get into this rhythm where if you have a creative process that you don't have to overthink, like atomic essays or like visualize value, then you can step back and do these other projects that maybe do have more cognitive, like a longer feedback loop, if you're writing a book or if you're designing a product, if you're doing whatever else. But for me, having that one stream or that one channel that you can use to just fire ideas out and like use it to like clear your writer's block almost, or clear your creator's block, is powerful. There's a great Seth Godin quote on that. Was it writer's block doesn't exist? There's no such thing as plumber's block. Like you just wake up and you go and you fix pipes, right? If you want to be a writer, then you wake up and you write.
Or you just push it through. You push it through till it comes out. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, that point you hit on with the constraints, I think it's just so crucial, because we say at the beginning, you know, writing every day is hard, but writing a 250 word essay under 45 minutes and publishing it is hard, but it's less hard. You have constraints around your, you know, creative process. You're mostly well known for the black and white. And can you say a little bit about how I think you said specificity unlocks creativity, some things like that, of, you know, when you add these constraints and you make it harder for yourself to do anything else, right? That's when you produce your best stuff.
Yeah, I think there's a few ways to think about it. One is, if you have a constraint, it puts the pressure on you to make the idea better. So if the vehicle is constrained, or if the thing that you can use to convey this thing is constrained, whether that's like word count or the format of an essay or the style of a graphic, your brain is working a different way that way. I think it's like, you're not thinking about stylistic stuff. Like as a graphic designer, you can have a blank sheet of paper and sit there for a day being like, oh, what color should this be? Or what typeface should I use? Or what style should this image be graded in? Versus like, how do I use these tools that I have at my disposal to best communicate this idea? So all of your mental energy is allocated towards refining the idea and not the frills of this thing. Like the function that comes first. Another way I started to think about it is like, if you give somebody, like say you have access to a workshop and you have like you have to build a table or something, and you walk in to Home Depot and you've got, I don't know, like 10 million like pieces of wood and tools and all that stuff. It's like, where the hell do I start? Versus you walk into a workshop, it's like, here's like 15 pieces of wood, nails, hammer, saw, do the thing. You just get to work and you do it. So I think, especially on the internet, especially on computers, it's like, I get this question all the time, like, what software is that? Or like, how do you, like, what tool do you use to do that? It's like, you're thinking about it wrong, right? It's like, just pick some constraints and just make stuff. And then the tool, you know, maybe you start another project and set a new constraint in a different tool. But that's kind of a frustrating question. I think everybody that's cracked anything, you know, even to a minor extent, gets that question all the time, which is like, oh, what software rendered this thing? It's like, that's not the thing that made this what it is. The thing that made it what it is the constraint that somebody chose to use. If they're like a prolific publisher, I think that's true. Obviously there are exceptions to the rule, but I think that's why, you know, you've seen growth in this program too. It's like, this is the thing. If you just said, hey, write every day, and there's no framework, there's no thing to fill, there's no like guidance on how long this thing should be, or what formats you can use within that. It's very difficult to start from a blank page, especially if you've identified as somebody that needs help creating consistently. So the constraint is really what allows you to be creative. There was this program on TV when I was growing up called Ready, Steady, Cook. And you had, I think it was like £10 that someone had. You go to the supermarket and you get to buy like whatever you could with a certain amount of money. And then they go into a kitchen on TV and it's like, these two teams have the same ingredients and you get judged on what you produce with the same set of two ingredients. And that's what creativity is, right? It's like, how do you do more, or, you know, how do you create something that didn't exist from the same set of things? Like you would consider one person more creative in that scenario than another based on how they thought about and how they executed with this like narrow set of constraints. And we like the distraction and the number of tools is just so infinite at this point. This may not have been a discussion 100 years ago because you have your typewriter and you just sit down and do it, right? But maybe it would be, I don't know, maybe it is the same. But now you can get lost in the world of tools and, you know, seeing people do certain things and start emulating them. You're far better off just like picking a set of constraints and being consistent, in my view.
You know, it was crazy. I had this wild experience about 2 years ago. I was working on a ghostwriting project for a Grammy-winning music producer. Like, we would all know who this person is.
Mm-hmm.
And he invites me to go up to his house in Seattle. And he had dude's worth, you know, whatever, 30 million bucks, whatever it is. And he builds this massive estate up in Seattle. And he's got a home studio that's gorgeous and like just the most incredible thing you've ever seen, right? And we're sitting in his home studio and he's got a grand piano there. He's got 50 vintage keyboards on every wall.
Yeah.
It's like the most over the top thing ever. And he turns to me and he goes, I'm having a really hard time making my next album. And I was like, why is that? And he goes, because I made my last album in a 1-bedroom apartment downtown. And now I have every tool on the planet.
Right.
And I don't know what to do with it all. And he literally, and we're sitting in a multi-million-dollar home studio. And he tells me, he goes, I think to make my next album, I'm going to go rent a 1-bedroom apartment in the city and make it on my MacBook with earbuds. And I was like, my brain just shattered because I think we all think like, if once I get here, then I can create, then I can be the professional, then I can do whatever. And you realize that those people get there and then they want to go back to the beginning because the beginning is when they had the constraint.
Yeah, I think this might be a fake story, but you know, Dostoevsky, have you heard this thing? Like, he got paid for his first book and he's like, he was rich, so he couldn't write a second book. So he's like, went to the casino and just like dropped all of it on red, lost. And he's like, all right, now I've got to write my second book. It's like, what motivates you and what like constraints do you require in order to get out of the situation you're in? This is just like kind of a frustrating reality of it. Like Visualize Value was born of me just smashing into a wall of not being able to continue on the path I was on. It's like being a creative studio that was everything to everyone and turn around any type of work in any type of deadline just was so exhausting to the point where it was like, I can't, this is impossible. So it just came out of necessity as well. And I think that is like the story you just told is a great example of that. Is like from the other end, it's like you've like completely inflated the set of possibilities to the point where you don't know where to start. And that's equally paralyzing.
Yep.
Yeah, it's like just a decision fatigue. Anytime you're thinking about anything other than whether it's writing and creating, distilling the idea, or it's designing and it's illustrating whatever idea you're trying to get across, it's just and we get so caught up in it. It's so crazy that because it feels productive. It's
right,
oh, I'm researching this new tool because that's going to make me a better writer. When in reality, I like to say Ben Franklin didn't have Rome Research or Notion or any of the tools that you think are going to make you a better writer, right?
Yeah.
He sat down at a typewriter and wrote,
That's great, man. Yeah. I can't even go to Whole Foods anymore. Like I buy the same stuff every supermarket you go and just like, it's just, there's so much stuff here. It's like, what did I buy last week? Just do that again. It's like, there's so many decisions you have to make on a daily basis that I think we have this like the definition of creativity in pop culture, or the way we're like taught to think about creativity, is like blank page, anything's possible, and like get like introduce as many elements as you possibly can. But like I think the most profound acts of creativity have been like simple as hell, right? They're just like reduction, or they've been really, really constrained in their execution. So it's like a paradoxical. Creating things you would think is a process of addition, right? And it's really you need to put some very specific constraints, especially to produce like, I mean, I can't even imagine what producing an album is like. Like that is like I mean, it's not dissimilar from writing, right? It's like you're putting words on a page that aren't there before. But to me, like a song just feels like, oh, I've got to produce 15 songs with 8 different layers of instruments and lyrics, and that's hard work. And the way, like, I could go down the rabbit hole on this because I just met somebody in the music industry who was like, there's no such thing as albums anymore. There's just songs.
Yeah.
And that's kind of similar to how ideas are, like what we're all doing is like, you're publishing an idea at a time and getting feedback on that one thing, because the collective consciousness just does not have the capacity to dwell on, hey, here's this 15-song album I've just made. Take an hour and 35 minutes out of your day and just enjoy it. Maybe there are some people that do that, but for the most part, it's that single compressed execution of this thing that like goes into culture and has velocity as a result of people enjoying it.
Yeah, I think there's like a perfect relationship there of, you used to put out an album and everyone would listen to the songs. Like you used to put out a blog post or a long book and people would read the book top down, sharing these ideas. But now it's very bottoms up. You need market validation on every step of the way. And the result is a book, or the result is an album from kind of these, you start from the bottom, you get validation on each step, because the last thing you want to do is waste your time putting something into the market that no one wants.
Yeah. Like A side and B side is another way to think about it, right? Like you publish this stuff to figure out what the A sides and the B sides are, and then you can build an album that's 20 A sides and it's going to bang.
And longer feedback loops, right? Like this is something I try and explain all the time, but if you were a writer 100 years ago, your feedback loop was once every 2 years, right? You wrote a book, you had to wait the whole plot process. It comes out. We'll see if anyone buys it. I learned something. That's a 2-year process. And now I can validate that in 90 seconds on Twitter. I think people really underestimate how valuable that mechanism is.
Yeah, have you guys read Psychology of Money?
Yeah, very interesting. It's a fun read.
It feels like that was the bottom up approach, right? Like these are like either you could see each chapter of this being a tweet or a short blog post, and
he wrote all those already, and he had a blog post that summarizes it. Like the blog post for the book came before the book. Like every one of the little things in that. Same thing with Mark Manson, like we've talked about, James Clear, all those like the most popular recent books have all been extremely bottoms up, and I just think that's the future, right? Because there's so much opportunity out there. The opportunity cost of putting something out top down and it being shitty is huge, right? Yeah. You have to get this validation over time, or else you're 3 years behind.
Yeah, and it's showing up everywhere. That's a great example. The guy I met in the music industry was talking about like TikTok being the vehicle for popularizing singles now. So you produce a single, and if it takes off on TikTok, right, it's the underlay to 10,000 viral videos. Like that creative asset is far more valuable than an album with 21 songs on it. And I think we could debate the arc of culture with that as the mechanism for validating things, but that's just the commercial reality of how things work now.
There's another, I mean, not to beat the dead horse here, but there's another fascinating example in music. Russ, he's this like hip hop artist, rapper dude, right? And same thing, he was just a kid putting out music, and he was putting out an album every year. And he's like, no one wants to sit down and listen to 21 tracks. So he changed the approach, and he started putting out one song every week, literally the same thing we talk about with writing, right? One song smart. Every week. And he, in what was it, 2019, 2020, was on the Forbes richest rappers of the year list. He was making more money than every other person with a record label, because he was like, I'm going to do it on my own. I'm going to put out one song a day or one song a week, and then take that sound. Oh, these singles are working. I'm going to compile them all into an album. Oh, my album just went platinum. Like the method is completely opposite of what it's always been now.
Yeah, that's that, and it's all a function of how easy it is to get feedback, right? It would just be the opportunity cost of, or the risk associated with sitting in a studio for 6 months and everything moving on is high.
And I think it's like you can complain about the rules of the game, or you can learn the rules and recognize they're the same for everyone, right? Yeah, it's probably not great that like TikTok validates music and Twitter validates single ideas now, but that's just the truth. And and it's the same thing with every crypto, whatever it is.
Right.
You get stuck in your ways and you complain that things are changing, and then 10 years later you wake up and it's like, oh shit, I probably should have adapted a little bit, right?
Minus 10% interest on your money.
Oh, we could go down that rabbit hole. That's another office.
Another day. Yeah.
All right. So we're a little bit over. I want to be definitely mindful of everyone's time. I know we can go all day. So why don't we do a couple more questions before the breakout rooms, because we're already past the hour mark. So anyone that needed to drop off probably has. So if you guys have specific questions for Jack, go ahead and toss them in the chat now, and we'll churn through them. I saw so many of them.
You said you got questions. I was just going to pick the Lil Nas X example. How he validated his music. You guys know that story?
Mm-hmm.
So he was taking his music and putting it on as a soundtrack to memes, and just so he was using a vehicle that was already culturally validated, the meme, right? The video or the GIF or whatever it was already gained a ton of traction. He put his track on it, throw that on Twitter, it would go viral again, and people were like, what the hell is this song? It's like, oh, it's Lil Nas X. I think Old Town Road was how he did it. Harry Dry did an amazing breakdown on it in marketing examples. But again, it's like, you can complain how the music industry works, or you can be like Lil Nas X, and you could just go and say, what is the market doing, and how can I get my content in front of the market in the most efficient way possible, the most elegant way possible. It's a great, that's a great example. I could dig that link up for you.
All right, so we have a few here. Let's see. I liked this one. What about the tension between writing what excites you versus using Twitter to write and validate what gets traction? So I'll start just with one point here. With the making noise and listening for signal, it's everything is an option, right? So you share an idea and it can resonate with you, resonate with the market. Ideally, you have that overlap. There is a lot where you can share it and it sits in that right Venn diagram where the market really liked it, but it didn't feel that strong for you to write. And then you don't take that option, right? But it's still an option, right? And at the same time, you can put things out that the market didn't necessarily like, but you really enjoyed, and try to get that into the middle of the Venn diagram. But the sweet spot is when you really find the ones that the market's resonating with. That's the sustainable path. If you can operate in that overlap, you're off and running. But Jack, we'd love to hear anything you have on that.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. I also think it's dependent on your objective. So I think you can think about it in a couple of different ways. You don't need a tweet to get 1 million impressions if your objective is to write a very sharp and pointed on a very sharp and pointed subject matter, right? Like this is where I think it gets interesting, is when you think about what is necessary for you to get where you want to go, and the algorithm and the things that you see in your own echo chamber can pull you in the direction of stuff that is just feels repetitive. And there's a contextual example that resonated with me the other day. There's a guy that I follow on Twitter who makes YouTube videos of like they're completely like nonsensical, right? Plays guitar into it, just like does these monologues, just does whatever he's feeling. And the YouTube algorithm is always telling him, hey, you should make videos about productivity, because like there's a bunch of businesses that want to advertise against the productivity keyword. And that is, it just drives everybody to producing the same type of content. But I think what we forget in that is you're also entering a market where the competition is 10, 100x, right? You could get a lot of surface level buy-in, or you can get a lot of like resonance on Twitter, but that doesn't necessarily equate to market value in its entirety. If you're like super tight and niche on something, the right 10 people seeing it is more important than 10,000 people retweeting it as a signal. Does that make sense? Like if you're writing about the like economics of decentralized finance versus like how to have a great morning routine, there's like the specificity, I think, is what unlocks the opportunity. And it's very hard to balance those two things, because you can produce things that resonate at scale that doesn't necessarily equate to economic opportunity. And that's a really difficult thing to understand, right? There are people who write incredible like comedic tweets on Twitter that have, that are getting probably 100 million impressions a month. I bet they don't make a dime off Twitter. And I know this conversation isn't necessarily about making money, but it feels to me like this community is like trying to deploy writing as a like professional skill. So I would encourage people to like, there's a bit of a gap to jump there. It's very seductive to write things that the market wants to hear, give the people what they want, all of those good things. But there's also an argument to be made for, I would take one like off Balaji instead of 10,000 likes off of, conquer wealth goals on Twitter. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. It's a density thing. The
Yes.
market opportunity, the audience is larger for some of these things, but the market opportunity is much larger for more specific things, right? So it's like yeah, you could get 100,000 likes or 100,000 followers, but if none of them are really interested in what you're saying, it's like it's a density deal. One question here I really want to hear your thoughts on as well. What is your general thoughts on, and obviously this could be 2 hours long, but
Yeah.
NFTs for creators, crypto for writers, designers, just your 2 or 3 minute overview.
Yeah, I think like right now, so early that you're going to see like huge disparity, right? It's going to be like top 1% getting they already have distribution that can take advantage of this wave of interest. Do I think the technology is interesting over the long term? Yes. But like, if you're writing a blog post every day, is now the time to like launch a series of NFTs? Maybe not. I think like we're going to see a difference between like subscribers and investors. So I think the mechanics of crypto allow for us to do over the long term is like get people more economically involved in funding creators as opposed to just like paying to see stuff, if that makes sense. So you share the upside. Like if I could maybe even, this is a great example. This would be a long conversation as well, but if the Ship 30 community were all economically invested in the financial outcome of everybody in Ship 30 for 30 in some way, then there's an argument to be made for like, hey, let's put like, say it's, I don't know how much it costs right now, but half of that goes into a token, and then the value of the community increases and the assets that get produced by the community increase, and then everybody shares in that upside. So I think the economic realities are like coming to light now. I don't think everybody should be auctioning NFTs for thousands of dollars because, again, like it's kind of a cheap, there's so much content out there, right? There's just like for you to, there's a level of arrogance to thinking somebody's going to spend thousands of dollars on one piece of creative work when there's tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of them pieces coming out every day. But the economic, like, I think there's some really interesting incentive stuff that could happen with it. So don't subscribe to my newsletter, buy 100 tokens, and then maybe even the gigs I get as a result of your support and you extending my work out into your network, you share in that upside. So I think there's going to be, it's going to mean different things for different types of creators, but in the like, outside of the very specific, like I'm selling a piece of art, because like I think that's already culturally accepted, right? That's already a practice that we understand. It's like you go to an auction and buy a painting. You don't go to an auction and buy a blog post. So I'm not saying that that's not gonna happen, but I think it's not as direct of a translation of behavior, and it's just a bigger gap to cross. So if you haven't shared it already, the generalist, I collaborated with the generalist, Mario Gabriel, and we managed to turn a profit on a one essay and 3 NFT collaboration where his readers backed it. And until then, his readers are just subscribers, right? There's no upside for them. And I think what NFTs do just across the board is like help you become not just a consumer, but an investor in the long-term output of a creator. And you think about, like, I could list 10 people now. It's like, you let me buy equity in that person, in the future of that person's work, even if it's 1%, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, I have a giant document that I've just been dumping thoughts into of like how crypto and Ship 30 and all that are gonna, because it's like community driven, shared upside. Like there's just so much here that I'm exploring too. So, well, it's for everyone in the chat on the token. The token is being discussed, and I think it would be a cool way to kind of get involved with all this. But I also want to do an NFT. I just passed 100 atomic essays, so I want to do like a Beeple style with all 100 of them kind of all put together, and that could be my dabble in there. But no, it's an exciting space. But Cole, it looks like you had something.
Yeah, I mean, just as BitClout, right? Like we've talked about BitClout a little bit, but this idea that, Jack, I own some Jack coin. Jack can have a coin, I can have a coin, Dickie can have a coin, whoever. But I think the meta, Jack, what you said is completely true. It's like funding creators, which is an interesting concept. If your coin gets to a certain point, I'm incentivized. I want to hold it because I want to support you and I want to show my support for you. You benefit because other people can see who's holding your coin. And then I also think we'll probably, I mean, this will probably happen way sooner than we realize, but you talk about funding creators, you could, in theory, then take out loans or take out other sources of funding against the value of you. So you go, I need 100 grand to make my art, but I'm valued at 500 grand. So I'm gonna take out a loan against my value. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening. And I think, I don't know, it's a rabbit hole. So I kind of think the best thing right now, maybe you feel the same or differently, is like, just poke around, like get to know kind of what's going on, but don't be super married, I think, to any one thing, because we're all figuring it out. It's all just
Oh yeah, it's an absolute, it's the Wild West out there, man, for sure. People are in the river with the
with the pans, like
All right. Well, this has been, we could go on for hours. I want to make sure everyone gets outside on this nice Saturday. And but anyway, Jack, thanks for taking the time to be with us. This has been, I got about 100 things written down that I want to flip back through. But it's an exciting time to be in the space we're operating in. And, you know, for anyone who hasn't followed Jack, if you want to just tell them where they can get you on Twitter and whatnot.
Yeah, just Jack Butcher and Visualize Value on Twitter. Thanks for having me. There
you go. So we're going to jump into breakout rooms for everyone who wants to stick around and chat with their crews. This has been, so we'll give everyone kind of a minute, and as normal, just pop in your Slack and grab your crew number. I'm going to open up the rooms and just chat about what you took away, what your takeaways for the week were, and then and I'm going to jump in some rooms too. So, Jack, thanks again, man.
Yeah, thanks, this is Jack. Awesome. You guys have built something great here. So thanks for having me involved.
Appreciate it.
Enjoy the day, man.